Well, good evening. No one mentioned it, but it's really good not to have the masks on tonight. I know we didn't have them on first day, the first class that we haven't had to wear them, so it's comforting to not have those. Last week we were discussing the flood. We had gone through several scriptures regarding the flood. We had 8 different events that we read about in Scripture that prove the global flood event. And we also, then we started getting into the science part of the flood, and we had talked about 6 of the 9 evidences. So we're going to cover 7 through 9, and then some more things regarding that. And also I want to get into where did the water go, and after that we've got we should get into some a little bit of the philosophy of science. So anyway, those are kind of the things we wanted to talk about. But just in review, last week when we finished up of the 9 evidences, number 1, we covered sedimentary layers across, sedimentary layers across continents and between continents. We discussed that. We also discussed the marine fossils on continents and mountains. If you remember that, we mentioned that we even found marine fossils on the Himalayas. Lack of erosion or rapid erosion between rock layers. We discussed that. We also talked about the catastrophic burial. If you remember the dinosaur death pose, we hit on that topic about how that it had to happen at a fast time and then lack of oxygen and all of those things. We also talked about unearthly seismites, about how those seismites were the squiggly lines caused from the water coming up through the sediment from an earthquake, and we still see those events today, but it happens in centimeters, and the evidence of the flood showed that they were in meters thick. In the Grand Canyon, you can see those where they're meters thick. So we had those, and we haven't had an event to create seismites that thick. And then also we talked about the long-distance sediment transportation. Again, we talked about how we see evidence of that with rivers and streams carrying things from one end of the area to another, but with a flood, you would see areas traveling hundreds to even thousands of miles, and we talked about the Grand Canyon sediment up in Utah, and also the Appalachian Mountain sediment that we found over in Utah as well. So that was up to 1,800 miles, so 1,800 miles. 1,800,000 would be a long way. 1,800 miles. So that brings us to evidence number 7. Does anybody have any questions on what we covered last week, or any comments on the flood, on those events that we talked about? Any other thing in Scripture or anything that you found? Okay. So evidence number 7, the Cambrian explosion. According to Genesis chapter 1, if you remember, we talked about the creation, and I always refer to that we can always go back to God created. So the Cambrian explosion, according to Genesis chapter 1 and following, a few thousand years ago, God directly created all kinds of life within 4 days. Not 4 billion years, 4 days. Approximately 650 years later, the global flood took place. And if the flood was global, a global event, creation geologists can make several scientific predictions. So based on creation, and we know that there's a global flood, we should be able to make some scientific predictions. So we're going to talk about 5 of these. So number 1, if there was a global event of a flood, number 1, very few fossils likely would have been formed prior to the flood. Number 2, and we're going to discuss each one of these. Number 2, transitional fossils between major phylogenetic groups would be non-existent in the fossil record. Number 3, instead, living creatures would appear fully formed, distinct, and functional the first time they appear in the fossil record. Number 4, we would be able to predict a significant marker in the geological column that represents the commencement of the worldwide flood event. And then number 5, we would predict an explosion of fully formed fossils above that line worldwide, representing the deaths of living creatures due to mudslides and other fossil forming processes during the global flood. So we're going to be able to talk about these things. So when one examines the fossil record, Testing the validity of the global flood predictions, we find that all 5 of the predictions are easily verified in the Precambrian layers. Before the flood, very little was found by way of fossils. So before the flood, there isn't any evidence hardly at all of any fossils Precambrian. So before the flood, that didn't happen. So those are predictions 1 through 3 that we mentioned. Above the Precambrian strata, a distinct line is observed that extends across the entire planet called the Great Unconformity, which is prediction 4. That line marks the beginning of the Cambrian strata, which would be the flood. That's the beginning of it. And the explosion of fully formed fossils called Cambrian explosion by paleontologists, and that's predictions 3 through 5. So they can't explain this, all of a sudden, boom, there's all these animals that are fossilized. And that's where you talk about the Precambrian and the Postcambrian. So we have that, and paleontologists prove that today. We have evidence of those fossils. So we have answered those predictions there, 3 through 5, that we talked about. So that describes that. Charles Darwin even admitted the Cambrian explosion as a problem for his theory. The Cambrian explosion not only falsifies evolutionary predictions, but it verifies at least 5 global flood predictions. So even Charles Darwin himself mentioned that he couldn't really explain this Cambrian explosion. Any questions or comments about the Cambrian explosion? Okay, that's evidence 7. Scientific evidence number 7. Evidence number 8, flood legends. So everybody understands that you have legends and stories in history. You have things that happen, and every culture will talk about it and has their own legends. I don't have any offhand, but anyway, that's kind of what we're talking about. This is called flood legends. So if there was a global flood event, one would expect flood stories passed down through different peoples and societies. What happened in Genesis chapter 11? Can someone tell me what happened in Genesis chapter 11? Tim shaking his head, yeah. Tower of Babel, correct. Okay, so keep that in mind. So in chapter 11, where we have God causing a language barrier at the Tower of Babel, there would be several years before the languages would have written documentation. So when everybody was confused by the languages, things were passed off verbally, okay? So you wouldn't have things that were in writing for probably several years before they started putting their languages together. So if a global flood event occurred, the story would have been passed along orally and not very dependable for detail, but all major points would have been passed along with other minor details not necessarily matching perfectly with our understanding. So all of you have done that in the classroom when you were young. You whisper into somebody's ears a little bit of a story, and then by the time it gets around to the end of the classroom, it doesn't match anything that you said. So we kind of have this type of situation. You have the Tower of Babel, those people that had that knowledge of the flood, and they passed it along orally. So some of those things, some of the points got missed, but there's evidence that these stories still contained in all cultures. There still is in all cultures a story of a great flood. So as predicted, cultures worldwide mention a global flood event, but the details do not perfectly match as predicted, but amazingly match in the essentials. They still talk about that there was a great flood, that it covered the earth, and they had their own story, but those are cultures that have this evidence of a global flood. So evidence number 8, we have these flood legends, and so those are consistent with a global flood. Any questions regarding the flood legends or any comments?
They use you hear more people will agree with like the legend of Gilgamesh.
Okay.
Than they would with Noah's Ark, that was a story that is very similar.
Yeah.
And I believe it was out like Persia or Iran.
Yeah.
And they will believe that much more than they would believe Genesis. They said that came before Genesis.
Yeah. So Kathy was saying that they'll believe the story of Gilgamesh before they will the story of Noah and the ark and the flood event. Any other comments? Okay. Evidence number 9, rapid deposition of strata. If a global flood occurred, then sedimentary layers of the Paleozoic and Mesozoic layers, flood rock strata, were laid down rapidly, possibly in as little as 1 year. Many of the strata below the surface at any one point during the flood, therefore, would still be soft, not yet lithified if there was a global flood event. The Paleozoic Tapete sandstone and the Muav limestone of the Grand Canyon show several layers of unbroken, tightly folded rock strata that shows they were not yet rock when they were bent, precisely what would be expected if the global flood occurred. So here we have evidence of that, where the rock was actually bent, or that layer was bent prior to it being lithified. So we have evidence of that also. So we have rapid deposition of strata, and so that's another scientific evidence. So we've gone through these the 8 scriptural evidences that we had, and then we just gone through 9 evidences from science that prove that we have a global flood, not a localized event, and also proves that it actually occurred. So we have all of this evidence, and we still have people that don't want to follow it or believe that. So any questions on that as we've ended the flood portion? I'm going to get into where did the water go now. Okay. So where did the water go? Again, this is all information that I got from Apologetics Press. So since we have shown both scripture and science support a global flood, and the waters really covered the earth, including the mountains, where did all the water go? So we have obviously vast amounts of water. The water couldn't have vanished from the universe. We need to account for it unless God wanted to remove it himself. The scriptures show God's direct involvement in the flood event. He communicated directly to Noah on how to build the ark. He sent the animals to Noah. He personally shut the door of the ark and initiated the flood. So the possibility of God using his supernatural ability to remove the water cannot be ignored. So we can't dismiss the fact that God obviously has the ability to remove the water if he wanted to. But before assuming that God miraculously did it as an explanation for everything that we do not know, which could lead to false conclusions, scientific laziness, and the lack of valuable knowledge about the natural realm God has created, let's consider another plausible explanation as to where the water went. So instead of just saying, well, God did it, which we get accused of that a lot from our scientific friends, we can give explanations for where the water went scientifically. So you have to follow me. This is kind of wordy. If the entire current Earth's atmosphere released its water, it would only cover the globe to the depth of about 1 inch above sea level. So again, if the entire atmosphere released all the water, it would just cover the globe about 1 inch above sea level. If all the Earth's ice, glaciers, ice caps, and ice sheets melted, it would raise the sea level approximately 230 feet. So now we're at 230 feet, 1 inch. If all of the water within the Earth's crust was pumped onto the Earth's surface, it would raise the sea level another 600 feet. This is a little more significant, but compared to the mountains that are some elevations 25,000 feet in height, the numbers pale in significance. So we have this water that we're saying, so where did all this other water come from? So where is the water from the flood that had covered the entire earth? Apparently the same place it came from. So turn over to Psalms 104. And we'll be going back to this scripture too. Now's a good time to return your, I'm just kidding. 104, 6 through 9. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys, to the place which you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. So when we had that, so while Scripture doesn't prove many details about what occurred during the flood, it does provide us with some important clues. So we read 104, 6 through 9. Also, I wanted to read Genesis 7, 11 through 20. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which is the breath of life. So those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So I wanted to read Psalm 104 and then Genesis 7. I want to read those accounts as we go through these important clues that the Bible provides for us regarding the flood and the water. So when the flood began, the fountains of the deep were broken up, as you read in Genesis 7. Also in Proverbs 3:20, it mentions that. Such terminology suggests the breakup of the ocean floor and the release of water and magma from below the earth's surface. With our knowledge in the 21st century, such terminology suggests plate tectonics, the breakup and initiation of the movement of the plates that comprise the earth's surface may have been activated at that point. So plate tectonics was most likely activated at that point when everything, like I told you a few weeks ago, that the earth during that flood, when the fountains broke up, the earth basically was turned inside out. So that started the plate, they believe that was the start of the plate tectonic movements. The second part, the breakup of the great deep is mentioned, followed by maybe causing the opening of the windows of heaven with the intense rain, as we read in Genesis 7 in those verses, talking about the heat, that extreme heat that went into the atmosphere would have caused that intense rain that came down from the heavens. So we have that happening in accordance with the great deep as mentioned. The third, the waters increased in Genesis 7:17 and greatly increased, verse 18, prevailing 150 days. That's mentioned in verse 24. After that, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. A great wind passed over the earth, and the waters began to recede continually. And that's found in Genesis 8, 1 through 3. So again, the third part talks about the waters being increased. Psalm 104 speaks of creation and of the flood. And then in verses 6 and 9, which is what we read, speak of the flood and tell us the mountains rose and the valleys sank down during the event. While some higher elevations existed prior to the flood, verses 19 and 20, the taller mountains formed during the flood. So we have this evidence of the valleys sinking and the mountains rising during this event. And then Psalm 104:9 indicates that the geological activity that occurred during the flood created a geographic setting that now disallows a global flood to occur again. So I don't know if you noticed that in verse 9. It talked about how everything was developed and built, that a worldwide flood can never happen again. So that naturally did that, and Scripture tells us so. So this further evidence to explain and support these scriptures. So when the fountains of the deep were broken up, apparently commencing plate tectonics, magma from the mantle would have touched the waters of the ocean, superheating it and blasting it into the atmosphere as superheated vapor. Where it came down as rain, many of the Earth's divergence zones stretched for hundreds of miles at the base of the oceans. Geyser-like activity would have created worldwide fountains that drenched the continents with immense amounts of water for possibly weeks. So that makes up the 40 days that the scriptures talk about. So until the Earth's tectonic plate slowed. So once the tectonic plate movement slowed, then these things would have happened. So we are able to observe the effects of the Earth's tectonic plates today. What happens when tectonic plates move today? What do we see? Earthquakes. What else? Volcanoes, actually mountain buildings too. So we have at a very slow rate. So we're able to observe this today, but at a much slower pace. So subducted plates angle downward. I want to make sure I didn't skip. Yeah. So subducted plates angle downward. This is how these things happen. Slowly diving into the Earth's mantle, dragging with them the ocean floor. On the rear side of the plate divergence occurs. Plates being pulled away from one another, forming gaps between the plates, and new material surfaces from the mantle to fill the gaps created, while plates move on the order of centimeters per year today. So we see this movement today, but in centimeters, forming mountains and volcanoes very slowly. When plate tectonics began during the flood, simultations show the rate would have been on the order of meters per second, forming mountains rapidly as this happened. So I wanted to read from this article. Okay, so I'm going to read some more about tectonic plates. Hope everybody's really interested in this, but it's fascinating to me anyway. If tectonic plates have always moved at the same slow rate that they are moving today, the subducting plate material would have heated and reached thermal equilibrium with the mantle material long before reaching the core mantle boundary in its descent. If the global flood model is correct, however, and the plates were moving rapidly at the onset of the flood only a few thousand years ago, immense slabs of colder material from the ocean floor would be predicted to be piled at the core mantle boundary that has not yet warmed to the mantle temperatures. Sure enough, yet another flood prediction was verified when technology progressed to the point that the Earth's internal structure could be studied. Colder slabs of material were discovered piled under the subduction zones deep in the mantle in the mid-1990s. So we have this evidence now. We found that we've been able to get close to the mantle, and we have colder material that was piled up just as a global flood, and that happening at a fast rate would predict. It didn't have time to heat up as slow as they're talking about. You know, if you're talking about where it evolved over 1 million or 1 billion years, that was too slow, and you wouldn't have had that. It would have heated up. When it happened really fast, it trapped that colder material. So the new material replacing the cold, dense ocean floor that is pulled toward subduction zones is much hotter and thus less dense. The effect is that the new material floats higher in the mantle. As the ocean floor was rapidly replaced with new mantle material during the early weeks of the flood, therefore more and more of the ocean water was continually being displaced onto the land until the entire ocean floor was replaced. Geologists and geophysicists estimate that at its peak height, the ocean floor would have been over 3,000 feet higher than its initial level. Plate motion would have slowed at that point, allowing the new ocean floor to cool, become denser once again, and therefore float lower in the mantle, creating the valleys that would allow the floodwaters to return to the oceans. The new height of the mountains and the topography of the ocean floor now prohibit the possibility of the reoccurrence of the global flood, as Psalm 104:9 implies. So our ever-increasing scientific knowledge continues to prove more and more clues that support and explain the global deluge of Noah. Whether the floodwater was removed supernaturally or naturally, there is no quandary created for the global flood model. So we have this evidence that even naturally that the floodwaters would have been back into, once that ocean floor it was 3,000 feet. So all that area under the ocean floor, that water would have had room to return back to the ocean from where it came from. Whew, that was a lot. Anybody have any questions regarding the flood? That was actually the explanation of the flood. Yes? Okay. So now, so we kind of got off on a tangent, but I thought it was important to cover the flood. We have to go back a couple weeks ago to what we were actually talking about, which led us to the flood, so we can go to the rest of the section of this study. So we were discussing, if you remember, we were discussing two types of design before we got into the flood, and I started talking about is Genesis history and those type of things, and then we got into the flood, and I wanted to go over the flood just for our understanding. But we were discussing two types of design. Can you tell me what two types of design we were discussing? Mm-hmm. Who said it? Somebody said it. Natural law, correct. So we were discussing two types of design, the intelligent and natural law. If you remember, I said Mount Rushmore was what type? Intelligent, and then the Grand Canyon was, and then if we want to do Groundhog Day again, we can go right back to.
All these set of stuff and all the quickly fossilized creatures, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
where are the human fossils? I'm always looking for time. Why are they not in the same layer?
Well, there are human fossils.
I mean, I'm talking about the same layers that are with.
I don't know.
They don't exist because they all seem to hold populated.
Yeah. Well, there are human fossils.
I've never heard any of that down that deep.
But, and I don't know. You may be right. I don't know.
7 areas because those should be in the same place. You would think because they all seem to have flooded and have been in the same area. I don't think I've ever seen something.
Yeah, I don't know. So Rich was inquiring about the human fossils at that level, and I can't answer that. I don't know if anybody in here knows. I don't know. Yeah, I'll look that up. See if there is or isn't. Any other questions? Okay, so we were talking about the intelligent and natural design. So Francis Crick, one of the scientists who discovered DNA, lamented that every time he wrote on a paper on the origination of life, he always concluded that too much speculation is running after too few facts. So here's Darwinists or atheists or evolutionists that even admit that and these are famous people. I mean, he's the one of the who discovered DNA. So they even admit that they have too much chasing after too few facts. They can't put facts together to support their theory. So a lesson from Darwinism: science is built on philosophy. Bad philosophy results in bad science, and good philosophy results in good science. So here we have Darwinism talks about following these scientific laws. We've gone into conversations about scientific law and things that they disprove evolutionists or Darwinist theories. So number one, science cannot be done without philosophy. So scientists assume that reason and scientific method allow us to accurately understand the world around us. That cannot be proven by science. It's a given. So these laws, we know they're a given. So this is what Darwin teaches. This is what's funny is, and they can't even do it. So that cannot be proven by science, but it's a given. Science, it's a given. You can't prove laws of logic, law of causality, the principle of uniformity, or the reality of observation. Those laws happen. Those things are it. And so philosophy, when you follow those, you can't change those. Those are fact. We have to assume those things are true. So science is built on philosophy, but unfortunately we have a lot of bad scientists that are bad philosophers. So that's number one. So we have to assume that reason and scientific method allow us to accurately understand the world around us. Philosophical assumptions can dramatically impact science. So if a scientist assumes beforehand that only natural law exists, then that scientist will not even consider creation, no matter how much evidence is presented to him or her. So I've discussed that before. If they are just believe that the only thing that exists is natural law, they're not even going to think about creation. So if they're already turned that way, it's not going to matter how much evidence we present to him or her. So if Darwinists presuppose that intelligent causes are impossible, then natural laws are the only viable choice. If creationists rule out natural laws, so this is on our part, if we rule out natural laws, we also risk missing the right conclusion as well. A scientist who is open-minded to both can follow the evidence wherever it leads. So that's the reason of this class. We as Christians can't be afraid of atheists, evolutionists, scientists. We can't be afraid of that because we have the truth. And we have to understand that. And anytime somebody asks a question, if you don't know the answer, have confidence that you're going to get the answer. We hit, like I said, Apologetics Press, I get questions all the time. I have no idea what the answer is. And you can get a hold of Apologetics Press, go on their website, and you can get those answers. But don't be disappointed if someone comes up to you and asks you some question about creation or evolution and you don't have the answer for, because I promise you we have the answer. This has been going on for thousands of years. The Bible's never been disproven. Our belief has never been disproven. And we've got to have that confidence as Christians. And that's why we're having this class. But I wanted to point that out, that we have to do that. So don't be afraid of natural laws. If something comes up and it has to do with science, don't be afraid of that. So we can follow that and find that, because it's going to lead us to the truth. Just like the Bible is the truth, it's going to lead us to the correct answers. Any questions or comments? Okay, number 3. Science doesn't really say anything, scientists do. Did you ever think about that? Science, the actual science, it doesn't say anything. It's usually led up to interpretation. So data is always interpreted by a scientist. When scientists let their personal preferences or unproven philosophical assumptions dictate their interpretation of the evidence, they do exactly what they accuse religious people of doing. They let their ideology determine their conclusions. And this is when we call the conclusion into question, because that conclusion is based on nothing more than philosophical presuppositions passed off as scientific fact. When I talked to Kyle Budd a couple weeks ago, he said that that's what the atheists and evolutionists do. He said they'll take somebody that's a famous atheist or evolutionist, and he'll write an article regarding something that was supporting atheism or evolution, and then they think that's a fact because this guy wrote it. Well, that's not. It's still a presupposition of his belief that they don't believe in creation anyway, so they're going to write an article that coincides with natural law. So we have to understand that. So let's not us be guilty of those things either. Any comments on that before I summarize? Yeah, you're right. Bill Ross says it sounds a little bit like politics, and that's probably right. No other comments? Okay. So summary of everything that we've been talking about the last 3 weeks or so. Life doesn't consist merely of chemicals. If it did, you could mix chemicals of life, I put that in quotes, and produce life, therefore materialism. So obviously we don't have something that you can just mix together and you have life. Life comes from life, intelligent life comes from intelligent life, and same with design. There are no known natural laws that created specified complexity. Information-only intelligence has been observed creating specified complexity. So again, you've got the Mount Rushmore, the heart in the sand, the cereal that you spelled out, take out the garbage. Those type of things, those are the only types of things that show specified complexity. You don't have natural law or natural events creating those type of specified events. So there are no known natural laws that create that complexity. The simplest life consists of an amazing amount of complexity. So you remember I talked about the amoeba, the 30 volumes of the encyclopedia. So here we have the simplest form of life has the equivalent of the 30 volumes of the encyclopedia in it. That's how much information's in that. So again, natural law can't create that. That had to be created by a creator. Science is a search for causes that is built on philosophy. There are only two types of causes, intelligent and natural. Remember, Darwinists only believe the natural exists. They don't even recognize intelligent cause as an option. I don't know if you've talked to people that are atheists or whatever. They're very difficult because they don't want to give you the time of day. They don't want to look at the evidence. They don't want to reason with you. And when you have science that backs creation, it's very frustrating to talk to them. But as Kyle mentioned to me, sometimes when you're responding to those type of people, you want the people around you to hear the answer more than just knowing that you're probably not going to convert that individual. But those around you, you might convert, or they might listen and have reason. Rich?
Yeah, I've just done some research of the question asking that there's several articles that are explained pretty well that 95% of all fossils found are invertebrate, which are hard shell, et cetera, creatures. The other 95%, 5% left are plants. And then most reptiles, creatures, humans, et cetera, are very low percentage of fossilization because of decay, rotting, and being scavenged up, stuff like et cetera, and just coming apart and rotting.
Yeah.
So it would make sense that that's why there's not just humans, but there are actually very, very, very low amount of any kind of mammal fossilized,
Yeah.
percentage-wise.
Yeah.
But that's, like I said, over 95% is simply insects and sea creatures.
Okay.
I thought about that and think about, you don't hardly ever see any other than that.
Yeah.
And plants
Yeah.
for the rest, so it makes sense that they would rot, decay, and be scavenged by sea creatures, et cetera.
Well, those at the surface, but those that were buried, obviously you can't because there's lack of oxygen, and that's why they fossilize.
He said there's actually very few mammals are ever, it's very hard to sink a mammal because they float and come apart and
Right.
decay before that would ever come
And that's what I was going to say too. You wonder how much we're up in the water, floating around, dead or whatever.
It takes so long to fossilize, it's considered very little, any mammals at all that are fossilized anywhere considered to be found in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah. And also you got to look at, don't just Google and go with one article either.
There are several, and they all, and it makes sense.
Yeah.
They found it.
Yeah. There's several articles regarding fossils and those type of things. Obviously, in this class, I don't have time to go in that much detail, but you could probably spend a whole quarter on that. So, but yeah, look, make sure you look at all that. And I recommend obviously going to Apologetics Press when you're looking at that information. Any other comments? Okay. And then also the last thing on the summary, spontaneous generation of life, which Darwinism requires, has never been observed. So that's the biggest point, I think, as far as the summary. None of that spontaneous generation of life, which that's what their whole theory is based on, has never been observed. It's never happened. So that's the summary of the last few weeks, and then next week we'll